Chapter 12. The Kana. Lewa raced through the burning marshes, leaping and skipping over the tangled mess of roots and shrubs that littered the ground. He hated the feeling of the soil squishing against his feet as he ran. But with the surrounding trees overtaken by flames, and now that he was rid of the levitation powers of his old Kanohi Miru, he had little choice. He knew he would have to adapt to his new form of transportation eventually, as there would soon be no more trees to climb. Part of him had already begun to miss the powers of his Kanohi, but these thoughts were aggressively dispelled when he reminded himself how much stronger he was now that he wore a Kana. Even without the power of levitation, he was still fast, agile, and the element of air was still his to command, which had proved to be an invaluable tool for cleansing the island. He had hoped to have caught up to the Le-Matoran by now. Ever since they helped him see the truth of the Bohrok, he hadn't separated with them until Onua had foolishly tried to interfere with their task. When he had first discovered the Toa of Earth had arrived in Liwahi, Lewa could barely contain his excitement. With his control over the Earth, Onua would have been a useful addition to the swarm, and could have likely helped him convince the other Toa to join. Lewa hadn't expected him to be so resistant, and failed to understand why. He wished he could make them understand the things Kadak and Gadak had revealed to him. He never wanted to hurt Onua, and the thought of it still tore at his heart. But he was given no other choice. Not only had Onua refused to help, but he had the audacity to try to prevent Lewa from carrying out his mission. He needed to be dealt with. That was what Lewa had continued to tell himself, desperately forcing away the persistent feelings of remorse for what he had done. As Lewa raced through the jungle, a broad tree trunk dropped down onto his path. He halted his run, skidding to a stop as he nearly lost his balance. He shielded his face against the shower of mud and sparks that fired out from the immense log as it crashed onto the ground. He looked up to see where it had fallen from, finding the nearby trees to still be standing. He briefly studied the way in which it landed, quickly drawing the conclusion that it hadn't simply fallen, but was thrown. Whirling around, he saw the pronounced shape of Toa Onua in the distance, illuminated by the surrounding flames. The glow of his Kanohi Pikari faded as he deactivated it, standing with his monstrous fists clenched and breathing heavily.
Nua,
Lewa called out, relieved to see his friend had recovered.
I'm true sorry about all this. It's not too past late to reconsider.
This is over, Lewa,
Onua said as he moved purposefully toward the Toa of Air.
I can't let you keep this up.
I warned you, Nua. The Bohrok are not the enemy. I heart wish you could see that.
That Kana is controlling you.
No, not controlling, informing, teaching.
What could they possibly be teaching you that would justify this?
Lewa sighed, shaking his head before responding.
Trust me, Nua. When the Le-Matoran gift gave me the Kana, I tried to counterfight its voice. I was fright scared, just like you are. But then, when I began to listen here, the Barag Queen's mind spoke the truth. They are not here to kill harm. We attack slew them first. But still, they keep holding no anger hate against us. They only want us to understand. The Kana was a favor gift.
I may not understand, but I'm not convinced you do either. They're using that thing to feed you lies.
Lewa broke his gaze from Onua, staring down toward the ground.
I don't believe that. Kadok and Gadok have no thought plans to harm the Matoran.
They already have, Lewa. 3 Onumatoran were drowned in a flood caused by the Bohrok.
What?
And more will die if we don't put a stop to this.
Lewa began to pace back and forth as he processed Onua's report. He grabbed his brainstalk, which began to ache as the Kana started to constrict his face harder.
No, the Bohrok never wished to kill anyone. This is a mistake. They wouldn't... You have to faith, trust me, Nua.
Look around at what they made you do. How can you say they mean us no harm?
Lewa strained against the creeping headache.
No, the Matoran are at blame fault. They aren't even supposed to be here.
What are you talking about?
If we join them, the Bohrok will pardon spare us when their duty job is complete.
And then what? What happens when there's nothing left?
The Barag. They will lead show us what to do next.
And are you willing to bet the lives of the Matoran on that?
Lewa struggled to form a response. He turned away from Onua, glancing overhead at the uncontrollable flames erasing the green of the jungle. The gnawing pain in his head grew as he felt the whispers worm through his mind. With his back turned, he knelt down, taking a moment to sort out the conflicting messages inside his brain.
Get out of here, Nua.
He finally said as he stood back up.
I don't want to harm you.
It's not too late, Lewa. Just take off the Krana.
Last shot chance, Nua. Go now.
Onua took a step forward.
I'm not leaving.
Lewa drew his axe from his back.
Then you're an obstruction.
Onua bore his claws as he widened his stance. The firelight flickered against the surface of their armor as the two Toa stared into each other's eyes. In a blurring flash, Lewa twirled his axe behind his back as he crouched low. He sprung forward, spinning through the air as he swung the axe. Onua stepped back, narrowly ducking beneath the blade before twisting back to his feet. Lewa bore down with a rapid pair of overhead strikes, which Onua deflected with his claws before ducking beneath a horizontal swing. Lewa rode the momentum of the axe into another spin, which Onua blocked once he had swung back around. Lewa weaved out from the path of Onua's swiping claws, signaling the Earth Toa's turn to switch to the offensive. Lewa messily blocked and dodged a storm of strikes, entirely unprepared for the surprising velocity at which they were dealt. Onua moved with a level of speed and agility that Lewa had not expected him to possess. Lewa ducked beneath another swipe before inserting an attack of his own. Onua caught the handle of the axe and forcefully shoved Lewa back, creating a modest distance between them.
We need to lure pool him toward the Earth Dwellers,
Tamaru said. Kongu glanced back toward the open field, watching the Onu-Matoran battle against the Le-Matoran.
They've got their hands full already.
Pass hand over your Kanohi mask, lads,
said the Turaga.
We have the ever-perfect Krana Cho's picked for you.
Not a chance, Raga. Our Kanohi fits suit us just fine.
Turaga Matau shook his head.
They always resist,
he said with a sigh, seemingly speaking to himself.
Don't worry, Stress. We'll show guide them what they're missing.
The Turaga pounced forward, swinging the blunt side of his staff toward Kongu. The Gecko captain ducked while Tamaru sprung forward, but was knocked to the ground when the Turaga whacked the side of his mask. Kongu continued to dodge the aggressive swings of Matau's staff, while Tamaru shook off the blow before rejoining the scuffle. Turaga Matau's staff, combined with his extended reach due to his larger height, put the weaponless Matoran at a clear disadvantage. Despite consistently attacking simultaneously, they were repeatedly knocked to the ground before they could land an effective hit. Kongu pushed himself off the ground, rushing back toward the Turaga while he was assaulting Tamaru. Kongu reached out, grabbing the edge of his poncho. With a sharp sound of tearing fabric, the Turaga was jerked back, tugging him away from Tamaru. Admittedly impressed by the surprise attack, Matau reached back and yanked the poncho from Kongu's grasp. He rammed the knob of his staff into Kongu's stomach, forcing the breath from his lungs. He then knocked him back to the grass with a downward blow to his brainstalk. Tamaru tried to grab him from behind, but the Turaga spun back, swatting him onto the ground.
They have us outnumbered!
Called Damek as he used the arm of his boxer to sweep 4 Le-Matoran to the ground. He turned the machine around to repeat the maneuver on 3 more that tried to attack him from behind.
We need more Madu fruit!
There is no more Madu fruit! Onepu shouted back. using the hook at the end of his boxer arm to tear open Atanok's chest.
We'll have to proceed without it. They just keep getting back up. We need a new plan.
In the heart of the grassy field, the Ussalry guards had hardly dented the numbers of the enthralled Le-Matoran since exhausting their Madu supply. Still sticking to non-lethal methods of combat, they were slowly overwhelmed by the opposing numbers. The Le-Matoran fired hundreds of flaming arrows into the grass, littering the battleground, but the morning dew simply extinguished the flames upon impact. They also seemed to avoid dealing fatal attacks, but had worked to remove the Kanohi of each Onu-Matoran they overpowered, and replace them with retrieved Krana from the destroyed Bohrok. However, the Onu-Matoran managed to reduce the frequency of these tactics by painting every Le-Matoran seen retrieving a Krana as a high-value target. Still, for the few that slipped by, their odds of victory only decreased. Taipu was grabbed from behind by 2 Le-Matoran and forced to the ground. A third approached him, reaching for his mask. Before his Kanohi could be removed, Taipu shrugged his arms free from their grip. He dropped the third with a right hook before fleeing from the first 2. Onua jumped up, tucking his legs high against his chest to dodge a low swing of Lewa's axe. The moment he landed, he struck back with a burst of strikes, switching between balled fists and open claws. Lewa deflected each blow, until Onua grabbed the handle of his axe. Taking advantage of the Earth Toa's grip, Lewa pulled the axe inward, driving his elbow into the side of Onua's head. With a sharp grunt, Onua released his hold on the weapon as he staggered through the loose soil. With barely enough time to recompose himself, Lewa was already bearing down on him. He dodged a downward chop, which cleaved through an exposed tree root and buried the axe blade into the ground. He wrenched it free and swung it toward Onua, who ducked beneath the swing before responding with a spinning back kick into Lewa's chest. Lewa was knocked to the ground, but quickly rolled backwards onto his feet. He thrust his axe into the air, generating a whirling cyclone, which spooled up the nearby flames from the trees and steered it toward Onua, who tried to evade it, but was too slow. He was ripped from the ground and pulled into the heart of the flaming twister before being launched into a nearby tree. The thunderous crack of the impact rang out as Onua's back crashed into the trunk. He fell to the ground, hastily patting away the lingering flames that stuck to his body before rolling out of the path of the falling tree, which kicked up a storm of sparks into his face. He stood up, gritting his teeth in pain as he glanced down at the visible burns spread between the gaps of his mechanical components. Lewa stalked forward, twirling his axe.
You're putting me behind schedule plan, Nua. We need to hurry rush this up.
Stop making me do this. This isn't you.
It is me,
Lewa replied as he reached Onua.
which is the only reason cause you're still alive. Get out of my way.
You're stronger than this. Fight back.
Lewa grimaced as the slithering whispers cut into his thoughts. He looked back toward Onua, winding his axe back.
If you insist.
He brought the axe down toward Onua, who reached out and caught the handle of the axe before it could reach his body. Lewa yanked the axe away, slicing deep into the palm of Onua's hand along the way. Onua yelped in pain, reeling his hand back. Lewa kicked Onua in the chest, knocking him to the ground. Onua rolled free of another blow from the axe before sweeping Lewa's legs out from beneath him. Onua scrambled on top of him, landing a succession of punches into his face, leaving space between each one for the real Lewa to speak up. But he never did. Lewa worked his foot up against Onua's chest and shoved him back, creating enough room to hop to his feet. Onua stood up, activating his Kanohi Pikari. To his surprise, Lewa's Krana also began to glow.
There is no need call for this, friends.
Matau said casually.
You're starting to damage hurt my feelings.
Kongu climbed to his feet for what must have been the 10th time and slung his feather braid off of his shoulder.
Keep this up, and we won't be in stopping at your feelings.
Kongu charged forward, weaving around a swing of Matau's staff and tackling him to the ground. Tamaru rushed in, reaching out to retrieve the staff from the Turaga's grasp. Matau pulled the staff away, grappling against both Matoran before kicking and swatting himself free. He rolled to his feet, kicking Kongu back before shifting his focus onto Tamaru. Matau swung his staff, barely missing Tamaru's head as he ducked beneath the attack. Kongu staggered back several steps before regaining his balance. With the Turaga distracted, he pounced from behind, kicking out the bend of Matau's knee and locking his arm around his throat. Caught by surprise, the Turaga wildly swung his staff over his head in an attempt to reach Kongu. Tamaru grabbed the staff and pried it from Matau's grasp. With their enemy now disarmed, Kongu grabbed at the Kana. The moment his fingers slipped beneath it, he felt it constrict tighter against Matau's face, which seemed to very suddenly enrage the Turaga. He grabbed Kongu's arm and flipped him forward onto his back, causing him to release his chokehold. Winded from the maneuver, Kongu rolled out of the path of Matau's foot, which left an imprint in the grass as he brought it down. Tamaru swung the staff, but Matau caught the handle and rammed it back into Tamaru's stomach before stealing it back. He then knocked Tamaru to the ground with a blow to his mask.
You try to still take what I've been gift-granted?
Turaga Matau growled as all traces of his old personality had vacated his eyes.
The cleanse must proceed. Set starting with you.
A piercing whir screamed out as Matau switched on the saw blade at the end of his staff. Kongu was forced back as he avoided the belligerent swings while Matau slowly closed the distance. As the Turaga pressed closer, Kongu was forced to protect his body by raising his arms up. He grunted and cried out as tiny chips of green metal sprayed into the grass when the saw blade repeatedly cut deep trenches across his forearms. After numerous slashes, Kongu stumbled backward as the Turaga stood over him, rearing back his saw blade staff.
Don't do this, Raga.
Kongu panted, holding his hand out as a sign of forced submission.
You won't be able for you to come back from this.
Kongu.
Matau muttered as he still held the staff over his head. He tightened his grip as he contemplated his next move. Before he could draw a conclusion, he felt a weak yet alerting impact against his brainstalk. He turned to find Tamaru had hurled the broken husk of a maru fruit at his head.
Get away from him!
Tamaru called out.
Tamaru, no.
Kongu muttered as Turaga Matau turned his attention toward his friend. The Ussalry guards were forced back as their ranks began to decrease. The Boxors had successfully demolished every Bohrok present in the battle, which only provided the Le-Matoran with more Kana to use to corrupt them. Much like Taipu, Gage and Damik's machines had been disabled by the mob, but learning from their mistake in allowing Taipu to escape, the Le-Matoran were ready for Gage and Damik, pulling them both out kicking and fighting before replacing their Kanohi with Kana. The frequency in which each Le-Matoran was successfully subdued or incapacitated had drastically slowed. With their Boxors still in the fight, Nuparu and Onepu held back a significant portion of the opposing army, but between the two of them, they were becoming overwhelmed.
They're turning our own Matoran against us!
Cried one of the Ussalry guards.
We don't stand a chance!
We can't give up.
Taipu replied, shoving back a Le-Matoran and tearing off his Kana.
The island needs us.
I hate to be the one to speak up first,
said another nearby guard.
but it might be time to start considering lethal force.
No,
Taipu objected.
we promised Kongu we wouldn't hurt them.
Is a promise worth our lives? Or the fate of the island?
Taipu wished to argue further, but struggled to find the words to form a proper case. Before he could, the Ussalry guard had already begun reloading his crossbow, which was only to be used on the Bohrok. He raised it, taking aim at an approaching Le-Matoran.
No!
Taipu shouted, smacking the crossbow down, which discharged the bolt into the grass by their feet.
I won't let you do it!
Taipu and the guard watched the same Le-Matoran draw back his bow and fire a flaming arrow that burned through one of the ropes that had been used to subdue a small group of his comrades, allowing them to rejoin the fight. They quickly dispersed, each finding an Matoran to target. The guard glared at Taipu before retrieving his crossbow bolt from the ground. The fires licked at the trees, further incinerating all traces of life in the forest, while a blanketing haze of gray and black smoke veiled the surroundings. The heated soil seared their every step as Onua and Lewa charged toward each other with their glowing masks. Onua ducked as Lewa leaped into the air, raising his axe overhead. Onua dropped to the ground, rolling beneath Lewa's path as the axe blade struck the tree behind him, causing its trunk to burst into shards. Onua whirled back and grabbed Lewa by the back of his skull, pulling him down onto the ground as the massive tree crashed down beside them. Onua dragged Lewa through the dirt before ramming his face into another tree, creating a deep crater in the wood. Hardly phased, Lewa planted his feet and drove his elbow into Onua's chest, forcing him to release his hold. Lewa tried to follow through with another strike, but Onua reacted with a swift and brutal uppercut, which launched him through the air. The force of the blow sent Lewa's body smashing through another distant tree like a cannonball. Lewa clambered to his feet and brushed the flames away as the toppling tree impacted the ground behind him. He charged back toward Onua, jumping onto a tree and springing off of its trunk as he wound his axe. Onua reeled back just in time to dodge the blade, which was embedded into the ground. Onua punched Lewa's chroniclad face, causing him to let go of the axe before he could free it from the ground. With his focus waning, Onua deactivated his kanohi, but as Lewa regained his footing, his krana only glowed brighter. Onua braced as Lewa snapped his leg forward, driving a kick into Onua's midsection that sent him tumbling across the ground. By the time he came to a stop roughly 40 feet away, Lewa had already retrieved his axe and was closing in on him. Onua hopped up, quickly ducking and weaving around a flurry of axe swings as Lewa attacked. Onua spun out of his path before twisting back with another punch to his face. Lewa's momentum was broken, allowing Onua to tackle him to the ground. Lewa easily shoved him off before kipping back to his feet. He strode back over toward Onua and grabbed him by his throat with one hand and lifted him up off the ground. When their eyes met, Onua looked deep in search for the real Lewa, but was cut short when he was thrown through another tree. As he lay on the ground, writhing against the heat of the soil, Onua shielded his eyes as the discharging sparks splashing off of the crashing tree beside him showered his body. With a grunt of exertion, he rolled onto his hands and knees, glancing up to see Lewa's distant silhouette stalking forward through the fire. Fighting against his burned and beaten joints, he rose to his feet yet again.
You can't fight this, Nua.
Lewa pleaded.
Quick, flee while you still can.
Not without you. I won't let this be your fate.
And I won't let this be yours. Go, Nua. I'm a lost gone cause.
I told myself the same thing back at Makuta's lair. But then you showed me otherwise. Let me help you, Lewa, just as you once helped me.
Lewa lowered his axe.
This isn't what I want, Wish. I don't want to be a pawn throw to these monsters. Please, help me.
I will.
Onua said gently, as he cautiously approached.
Will you let me?
Yes, Nua. Please hurry haste. It's me right now, but in 10 seconds it may well not be.
Okay.
Onua replied, quickly stepping forward and reaching out to remove the krana. The instant his talons made contact, the krana constricted, sending a stabbing pain into Lewa's brain.
Get away!
Lewa shouted, shoving him back. Onua barely had enough time to twist his body to the side as the blade of Lewa's axe sank into his shoulder. Onua bellowed as he fell to his knees, clutching the blade. He pushed Lewa back before tearing the axe free and tossing it far out into the burning brush. Lewa stared at him sorrowfully before moving away to retrieve the weapon. Onua slumped, still clasping the open fissure across his shoulder armor that exposed the hemorrhaged muscle tissue underneath as he fought to catch his breath through the stifling smoke. Tamaru rolled to the side, evading the spinning saw blade of Taraga Matau's staff, which left a deep rut in the grass as he pulled it back out. Once he had successfully stolen the Taraga's attention away from Kongu, Tamaru had yet to think of the next step of his plan. In the meantime, he was forced to run and dodge from Taraga Matau's attacks. Kongu watched from the distance as Matau relentlessly lashed out at Tamaru. He looked down to inspect the deep cuts across his forearms, dreading the thought that Tamaru would be their next recipient. He thought back to the look in the Taraga's eyes before he became distracted. He felt as though, for the first time since arriving on the battlefield, he saw a fleeting glimpse of the real Taraga Matau. Tamaru's selfless act likely saved Kongu's life, but he couldn't help but feel it were also possible that he marred any chance of reaching their former village elder. Either way, Tamaru was now the one in immediate danger, and he wasn't willing to wait around for the minimal possibility that the Taraga would have a sudden change of heart, as much as he hoped for it. He needed to act. And he couldn't just shout out to the Taraga to draw his attention without a further plan the way Tamaru did, as that would likely result in an unending loop of taking turns as the intended target. He scanned the immediate area in search of a solution, becoming increasingly desperate with every attempted strike toward Tamaru. Just a few yards ahead, he found the imprint of a discarded Le-Matoran bow lying in the grass. Tamaru ducked beneath the saw blade again. He popped back up and tried to shove the Taraga back with limited success. After staggering for only a few steps, the Taraga regained his balance. He reached out and grabbed Tamaru's wrist and threw him to the ground. Before Tamaru could recover, Matau rolled him onto his back and held the saw blade over the Le-Matoran's neck. Tamaru struggled to free himself, but Matau only pressed his foot down harder. He grabbed the handle of the staff and tried to resist it being pressed any closer, but began to slowly lose the battle. If the Taraga had said any words to him while he stood over his conquered body, Tamaru did not hear them, as the ring of the saw blade that inched closer to his neck drowned out all other sound. While still straining to hold back the blade, he looked up at the Taraga with pleading eyes. Taraga Matau returned the glance, causing him to hesitate once again. After a brief moment, the Taraga shook his head, breaking his eyes away from Tamaru's as he continued to press the staff down.
Raga!
Kongu called out from further out in the field. Taraga Matau snapped his head toward the source of the call, finding the Gecko Force captain standing among a mess of spent arrows sticking up from the grass from the battle, one of which was drawn back into the bow he was aiming. Before the Taraga could react, Kongu released the string. The Taraga's head jerked backward as the arrow struck between his eyes. His staff fell from his hand, landing beside Tamaru's head before he collapsed backward into the grass.
Matanui, forgive me,
Kongu said before forcefully throwing the bow down into the grass and rushing across the field, where he fell to his knees beside the Taraga's body.
You shot him, Kongu?
Tamaru gasped.
You kill-shot the Raga!
What other choice did I have? Let him saw spell your throat?
Whatever are we supposed to do now? Who's going to lead on the Leaf Brothers?
Kongu picked up the Taraga's slacked hand and held it tight against his chest. A fountain of silver liquid bubbled up from where the arrow had pierced the Kana, which ran down the sides of Matau's head and dripped into the grass. He turned back toward the battle behind them, struggling to make out the vague shapes of chaos as the tears in his eyes blurred his vision.
I don't think there are any more Leaf Brothers to lead run, Tamaru. They belong to the Bohrok beasts now, and all we've done is drag Paul the Earth Dwellers into their aim sites. We're all that's left.
Tamaru placed his hand on Kongu's shoulder.
Just know that you didn't kill Slay the Raga. It was those nasty bad creatures. They did this, not you.
Kongu nodded impassively. They both looked down at the Taraga. The Kana constricting his face had shifted from a deep blue to a pale yellow as its hold had loosened.
Ever least, he's free now.
Tamaru added. He dropped down and embraced the Taraga for a final time, prostrating his kanohi over his chest. After a sustained moment, he quickly sat back up in surprise.
Kongu!
What is it?
He's breathing!
What?
Kongu replied in disbelief, quickly turning the Taraga's head to the side and cupping his hands over the back of his skull. Confirming Tamaru's report, he could see the faint ruby glow coming from within the brainstalk. Turning his face back up, Kongu pulled out the arrow, and with it came the Kana with little resistance. After tossing it away, he brushed his thumb over the Taraga's bare forehead, finding only the tiniest indentation from where the arrow struck.
The Kana mask won't stop the arrow,
Kongu realized, turning the Taraga's naked face away out of respect.
He still lives.
So is he going to be good fine?
I do think so. So long as we can spot find his Kanohi mask. But the Earth Dwellers still need our help first.
Lewa kicked around through the burning shrubs in search of his axe. He waved the smoke away from his face to get a clearer view, when he finally spotted it lying within the flaming undergrowth. He picked it up from the ground, cringing as he felt the heat of the metal handle burn against his hands. He turned to the east, preparing to bound away to join the Le-Matoran, when he heard the sounds of movement coming from behind. To his disappointment, Onua stood up.
Am I going to crave need to kill you, Nua?
Maybe that's what it's going to take.
Onua replied, staring into Lewa's eyes as he lumbered through the burning jungle. When he stepped up to the Toa of Air, he reached out and grabbed the handle of his axe in a motion so relaxed that Lewa hadn't felt the need to resist. Without taking it from Lewa's hands, Onua guided the blade upward, pressing it firmly against his own neck without breaking eye contact.
I'm done fighting, but I'm not going to get out of your way either. If your allegiance truly lies with the Bohrok, then prove it, right now. It's the only way to be rid of me.
Don't force drive me to do this, Nua.
Lewa pleaded as he tried to pull the axe away, but Onua held firm, pressing the blade harder against his neck.
I'm not forcing you to do anything. I'm giving you a choice.
I don't want to do this. I don't want to kill you.
Then don't. Break free of their hold.
I can't. They're too strong.
And so are you, Lewa. You are Toa. Prove yourself worthy of that title.
Lewa felt the stabbing pain return to his brain, this time more intense than it had ever been. With a cry of agony, he let go of the axe, which only increased the intensity of his suffering. He stumbled back, thrashing and screaming as he grabbed at the Kana. He tried to pull it free, but it only constricted tighter while increasing the pain signals, causing him to drop to his knees. Still fighting against the torture, he crawled toward the nearest tree and secured a tight grip around its trunk, where he proceeded to bash his head repeatedly against it. Still, the Kana punished him harder. He pushed away from the tree before digging his fingers beneath the Kana. He felt the sensation of molten metal pouring into his brain as he slowly peeled the organic mask from his face. The pain intensified with every second until it very suddenly ceased as he ripped it off. Feeling his strength drain away with the Kana, he launched it into the fire with such force that he collapsed onto his hands and knees. Onua rushed over to his side, kneeling down beside him.
They're gone.
Lewa panted, feeling as though the gravity had doubled without his mask.
I don't hear the dark whispers anymore.
Onua placed his oversized hand on Lewa's shoulder.
You're free. You won.
I was fixed going to kill you, Nah.
I never believed that.
Lewa lifted his heavy head, glancing over toward the deep gash in Onua's shoulder that dribbled a red and silver marbled fluid that glistened against the surrounding firelight.
Nah.
It's fine. I'll worry about that later. For now, we need to get out of here.
Lewa weakly nodded before being hit with a sudden realization.
The Le-Matoran. They're engaging in a battle fight with your Earth Dwellers in the Baldlands. We have to stop them before it's not already past late.
Wait here.
Onua said as he stood back up.
I know where I left your mask.
Without hesitation, Onua rushed off as swiftly as his burned and battered body could allow, which did not go unnoticed by Lewa. Although he was barely gone for more than 2 minutes, the wait was grueling. Without the energy provided by a mask, Lewa nearly passed out from the heat, only for Onua to return before he did so. As he was too weak to raise his arms, Onua helped him don his Kanohi Miru before handing him his axe. Instantly revitalized, Lewa sprung up from the ground, shaking out his muscles as he finally felt like himself again.
We need to hurry rush. Tag, follow me.
Nuparu positioned his body into a roll as he was forcefully yanked from the pilot seat of his boxer. He pushed himself off the ground, wiping the grass stains from his armor. He thought back to where he went wrong, recalling how he had somehow allowed himself to get overrun before the Le-Matoran tipped over his boxer and tore open the visor hatch. He was now completely surrounded, and when he stood up, he was jolted by the sharp sensation of an arrowhead pressing into the back of his neck.
Impressive trinket toy, Earth Dweller,
said the Krana-bound Le-Matoran standing behind him with his bow drawn.
but you'll have to do better next time.
I always do.
Nuparu calmly replied as he slowly raised his hands in surrender. Nuparu winced as the arrow tip pressed harder into his neck, forcing him to walk forward in their custody. He was led toward the remaining members of the Ussalry that had been pulled from their crabs, which were forced together in a tightening circle closed in by the nearly 800 remaining Le-Matoran, as well as more than 50 Onu-Matoran that had been fitted with Krana during the battle. He glanced to his right, finding Captain Onepu being led in a nearly identical state. When they reached the circle, they were shoved forward among the rest of the captives, finding themselves standing beside Kongu, Tamaru, and Taipu.
What do we do now?
Taipu whispered.
Relax,
Kongu replied.
I'll quick think of something.
As Kongu tried to form a plan, one of the nearby Ussalry guards raised his crossbow in defiance. Before he could fire a shot, his hand was struck with an arrow from a fast-acting Le-Matoran. As he dropped to the ground, writhing in pain, he was plucked up and dragged across the field, where his Kanohi was forcefully removed and replaced with a Krana.
Let this be a sign lesson to the next Earth Dweller that tries to struggle fight back,
shouted one of the Le-Matoran.
Aren't you planning on doing that to us anyway?
Nuparu asked.
Not much of a deterrent, if you ask me.
Who speaks said that?
Called the Le-Matoran.
Right here.
Nuparu replied without hesitation. The Le-Matoran stepped up to Nuparu and began to stare him down, but found the engineer to be thoroughly unimpressed by the intimidation attempt. Without breaking eye contact, he drew a knife from his thigh and began to wave it in front of Nuparu's mask.
You Earth Dwellers are always so smart-wise, aren't you?
I like to think so.
Nuparu shrugged. Onepu hesitated before ultimately coming to Nuparu's defense.
He has a valid point. If anything, one would think it would make us want to resist more.
Nuparu turned toward Onepu in surprise, who responded with an assuring nod. The Le-Matoran lowered the knife from Nuparu's Pakari as he turned his attention toward Onepu. And although the reason why was completely unknown to the Ussalry captain, that was what he intended to happen. When the Le-Matoran approached him, he halted, staring back and forth between the two defiant Onu-Matoran.
I have to admit,
said the Le-Matoran with an eerie smile.
You both make a true fair point. Looks like we'll have to change our approach.
Before they could react, the Le-Matoran grabbed Taipu by his shoulder, pressing the knife into his throat while dragging him away from the group. The other members of the group shouted in protest as Taipu was thrown to the ground with the knife still pressed against him. Many Ussalry guards raised their weapons in Taipu's defense, but were instantly forced to back down at the sound of hundreds of drawing bows trained at the group.
What about now?
The Le-Matoran asked after pulling Taipu up onto his knees and facing him toward the group with the blade still held firm against his neck.
How's this for a deterrent? We weren't planning on doing this.
Kongu, do something,
Tamaru whispered. Kongu looked into Taipu's fearful eyes before letting out a sigh.
We surrender.
The Le-Matoran smiled as he lowered the knife and gently led Taipu back toward his group.
Smart wise call, Kongu. We all fancy like dear Taipu, and I'd sorry hate to have to do that to him. I'd be glad you came around.
Why did you do that, Kongu?
Taipu asked.
We can't give up.
Kongu hung his head.
I said nobody dies today. That still stands. We'll just have to pray trust the fire spitters have better break luck against us.
Everyone, gather form into rows. We need to make sure we have enough Kana masks to go around.
The depleted group of Ussalry guards begrudgingly complied with their captors, migrating into organized rows to allow themselves to be counted. Many disdainful and disappointed glances were fired toward Kongu as the Onu-Matoran filed together. The Le-Matoran gathered up the remaining Krana and laid them out on the grass, where they began to silently sort them according to their kinds. Before they could finish their task, the ground began to tremble. The enthralled villagers fought to maintain their balance as the earth tore open, swallowing up the pile of collected Krana. Out from the freshly formed rift sprung Toa Onua, snatching the first Matoran in his line of sight and tearing off his Krana with one hand. Catching them by surprise, he then proceeded to charge forward, plowing through the gathered mob. Just as they processed the situation, another Matoran was plucked from the ground in a green blur and lifted into the air. Toa Lewa peeled the Krana off his face before lowering him to the ground and locking in on his next target. Regaining their bearings, the enthralled Matoran aimed their weapons toward the Toa. Onua dug his hand into the soil, generating an earthquake that prevented them from properly aiming their weapons. Before an aimless mess of arrows and crossbow bolts could be fired, Lewa conjured a sustained blast of wind from his axe, sweeping through the crowd and forcing them off their feet.
Now's our chance,
Nuparu called out, following the captive Matoran to charge forward. Now, with the help of the Toa, the remaining Ussalry guard as well as Kongu and Tamaru rushed through the stunned crowd. The Matoran turned their focus to the ones that had already been knocked to the ground, confiscating their bows and knives and subduing them until the Toa could reach them and wrench away their Krana, as they lacked the strength to do it themselves. Although they both showed clear signs of fatigue and wear, Lewa made much faster progress, as Onua was forced to fight with heavily limited use of his right arm. Once catching notice of this, the Krana thralls attempted to exploit the impairment by attacking his right side. Lewa flew to his aid, gliding his axe blade across several Krana with delicate precision. Many of the Ussalry guards focused on returning the dropped Kanohi of their fellow warriors that had been overtaken, allowing them to rejoin the fight on the correct side. Others fired crossbow bolts into the discarded Krana that the Toa had removed, preventing them from being forced onto new hosts. Although still outnumbered, the Ussalry slowly gained the advantage. "They're retreating!" Onepu shouted.
Don't let them!
Kongu called back. As the enthralled Matoran began to retreat toward the north, the Ussalry guards had remounted their crabs and rode ahead to cut them off. although many dozen managed to slip by and retreat into the wilderness. They worked through the army, removing the Krana one by one until the enemy numbers had been noticeably depleted. Repeating the tactic they had used against the Nuvok when they first emerged, Onua dug his claws into the ground to produce another earthquake, while Lewa flew across the battlefield to remove and destroy the Krana of those that fought to stay standing. The Le-Matoran were thrown into a panic, now forced on the defensive and unable to escape. Despite still having the greater numbers, their desperate and disorganized attempts to fight back proved largely ineffective with two Toa on the opposing side. As they inched closer to victory, the Toa's endurance began to wane. Still, they fought on, cutting, tearing, and plucking away every Krana until none were left. When the battle was over, hundreds of Le-Matoran were scattered along the grassy field, rendered weakened and unconscious without their Kanohi to sustain them. All of the Onumatoran that had been overtaken during the fight had been freed with their masks returned. Little time was wasted in removing the Krana of the nearly 500 enthralled villagers that had fallen into the pits at the start of the battle before they could wake up. The guards dragged the sleeping bodies of the former Likoro residents across the field, where they were laid out and counted by Kongu and Tamaru. When it was concluded, they found little more than 200 of them had escaped the battle, and were likely scattering themselves across the island. Utilizing the nets, ropes, and other traps left over, Onepu organized multiple task forces to seek out and round up the straggling thralls, with explicit orders that they remain unharmed. With Liwahi still burning, Lewa directed his attention to the jungle, working to suffocate the flames by absorbing the nearby oxygen, though the damage was far too widespread to take on single-handedly. Although he was able to clear a path for Onua to make numerous trips back to the Kanohi graveyard he had found on his way through the ruins of Liwahi. On the way there, he was given the full story of Nuparu, Onepu, and Taipu's survival, as well as the invention of the Boxors. With the help of several Onumatoran, they gathered every mask they could find amidst the destroyed forest, and brought them to Kongu and Tamaru, who got to work identifying their owners as the sun set.
"This is a breeze easy one,"
Kongu said after Taipu handed him a great kakama that had been decorated with white paint.
"That one belongs to Afa. He's over there in the third line row, fourth from the end."
Kongu then picked up a noble matatu and began to inspect it.
"I'm not true certain, but I heard feel this goes to Makani."
Nah,
Tamaru corrected, pointing to the corner of the square-shaped mask.
See spot that scratch? That's Orcom. Remember that time his Goku buck threw him into that Volo?
Of course.
Kongu replied with a light chuckle.
"Sharp good eye. I true think he's over there."
Kongu handed Tamaru the mask before walking over to Taragamato, who sat wearily in the grass a short distance away. He once again wore his signature noble mahiki, which covered up the small notch in his forehead. Kongu sat down by his side, where they both sat in silence for a long moment.
"I'm true sorry, Raga,"
Kongu finally said.
"I had to quick make a choice."
Don't fault blame yourself, Kongu.
The Taraga said before mustering a smile.
At least it all worked out in the end. You made the true right choice.
But what if the Krana mask hadn't halt-stopped the arrow? What if I killed you?
Either route way, Tamaru still lives. It was worth the gamble risk.
I just... curse these Bohrok beasts. Battle-fighting Rammer is one thing, but to have to clash harm someone I care about, that was...
I understand, Kongu,
Taraga replied, placing a hand over the Gakko captain's shoulder.
Ever more than you know.
Kongu nodded silently as he placed his hand over the Taraga's.
Kongu.
Taraga Matau gasped as he finally caught a proper look at the deep gashes across Kongu's forearms.
It's all right fine, Naga. I'm through sure they'll buff rub out.
The Turaga stared at the wounds, fully aware they would be lasting reminders of his failure. He opened his mouth to speak, but instantly choked on whatever he had intended to say before breaking down entirely. Unable to find the words of his own, Kongu embraced the Turaga as he sobbed into his chest.
I hope that's all of them.
Onua said once he returned with another handful of retrieved kanohi.
I wasn't able to find any more.
That's good, fine.
Tamaru replied as he and Nuparu collected the masks from the Toa.
If we're slip missing any, they can just brief where the leftover ones until Onepu seek finds the stragglers. Many thanks, Toa.
Toa Onua,
Nuparu said.
You have our utmost gratitude for all you've done for both the Matoran and Matanui, especially for your help today. That is something that couldn't possibly be overstated. Therefore I say this with the utmost level of respect few have been granted. You look terrible.
I can't deny I've had better days.
Onua replied as he glanced down at the visible burns and scuffs that coated his armored body.
But I'll be fine.
If need be, I'd be happy to take a look at those injuries for you. You can't convince me that that absolute chasm split in your shoulder isn't excruciating. I saw the way you were refraining from using that arm earlier.
That's a kind offer.
Onua replied as he ran his talons along the gaping wound on his shoulder, wincing from the pain.
But I'll have to decline for now.
Probably for the best, I suppose.
Nuparu replied as he glanced across the field at the scores of wounded and worn Matoran of both air and earth.
I'm about to have my hands full anyway. But the offer stands if you change your mind. And please, ensure Toa Liwa is aware that extends to him as well.
Onua looked back at the rising flames illuminating the darkening sky throughout the distant jungle, eating away what remained of Liwahi.
I'll let him know, but it will have to wait. We have a lot of work to do.